guess I should really say good day, as we have, I know, participants joining us from around the world, including our two panelists who are joining us from OECD offices in Paris and our moderator from New York. I am really looking forward to the next hour where we're going to discuss a paper that came out just last month. The first paper, I understand, put out by the OECD as a self-standing OECD publication on the North Korean economy. Of course, the OECD has looked at the Korean Peninsula, particularly the South, for many, many years and has deep expertise, but this report really captured our attention at KEI because of its depth and its insights. You know, a lot of other things are going on and we're all caught in an especially fierce urgency of now, but I think even more now, I really welcome the great interest in this report that we see through the participants here, and I very much thank the panelists, the authors, and our moderator for joining us for this discussion. Our moderator is Dr. Randall Jones, who had a long career at the OECD as the Senior Counselor for East Asia and the head of the Japan-Korea desk. We are very pleased, in addition to being the visiting fellow at Columbia University in New York, he's a non-resident fellow here at KEI, and I also commend to you a report on our website that he wrote just about 10 days ago, I believe, on the South Korean economy. Very timely, very helpful. But today our focus is on the DPRK, and we're looking forward to our panelist discussion, both from the OECD Economics Department, Vincent Koen and Jinwoan Beom, tuning in from Paris, where I guess it's about time to have a glass of wine, perhaps. But we very much welcome you, and without further ado, I want to turn it over to Randall, and again, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. I'm very delighted to be here today with two former OECD colleagues. Their biographies are available, but I'll just say a few words about first Vincent. He became my division head in 2008, and we collaborated on 6 OECD economic surveys of Korea, as well as 6 on Japan. And in 2010, in fact, we had a one-day trip to Geaseong to visit the industrial complex. Jinwoan joined the Ministry of Economy and Finance in 2006. He came to the OECD in 2019, and he also has experience in North Korea. He negotiated with the North Korean officials in Geaseong, so he's probably a real expert in that regard. So thank you very much for this working paper. I love the title of it. North Korea, is it the last transition economy? Usually when we think about North Korea's path of development, people look at China or Vietnam as role models in a sense. And North Korea is very different than China and Vietnam, which developed the agricultural sector and used that to finance industrialization. North Korea was actually a industrialized economy back in the 1960s and a very urban economy. So does that suggest that North Korea's path of development will be more similar to that we've seen in Eastern Europe rather than in other Asian transition economies?
Thank you, Randall. I'm delighted to take part in this seminar and to talk to you again. I would say that the process of transition is very haphazard in North Korea, very with fits and starts, without a clear vision for the destination and without a clear model, be it China, Vietnam, or Eastern Europe. Perhaps just briefly some historical background on what happened in North Korea. And North Korea missed the boat in the early 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed and Eastern Europe embarked on a transition, partly probably because Kim Il-sung feared losing control over the people. And then when he died in 1994 and his son took over, he also was apprehensive about losing control. And as a result, this collapse of the Soviet Union and the change of terms with China led to a very deep crisis with a major famine and hundreds of thousands or more of casualties. And this famine in turn prompted marketization from below in the food sector with households growing food on small plots of land and selling the surplus in local informal markets, which over time became general markets. And you can see as background for my presentation today, just behind me, a map of the 500 or so general markets across North Korea. This is not even counting the informal black markets that operate outside of government control and the intermittent farmers markets. But this process of transition has been with stops and goes. For example, in the late 2000s, as we document in our paper, Kim Jong-il tried to reverse marketization because he worried about its political implications and control over the regime. And he took measures to restrict the activity in markets. And then in 2009, he went for a monetary reform, which was essentially confiscation, and ended up disastrously with the effect of spurring dollarization, or should I say, perhaps in the case of North Korea, yuanization. And when Kim Jong-un replaced his father in late 2011, he gave a new impetus to marketization and modernization, but also timidly and also in fits and starts. We regularly read about crackdowns on markets. Actually, in recent weeks, this has been happening again. I can recommend today's piece in NK Pro by Peter Ward on the matter.
Thank you very much. Let's talk a bit about Kim Jong-un's economic policies. 2013, he turned away from his father's policy called Sangung, which is putting the military first, and replaced it with the policy called Byungjin, which means parallel development of both the economy and the military. Well, we had one good year in 2016, 4% growth, but then we've had negative GDP growth since then. Does this reflect flaws in his strategy, or is it more a result of test in 2016?
Well, indeed, the Bank of Korea's guesstimates suggest that the North Korean economy shrunk by 4% or so in 2017 and another 4% in 2018. And presumably this continued hit. But how reliable are these data? North Korea is a statistical black hole. At the OECD, we're very much used to comparing countries by using scores of data. But the problem with North Korea is there are no real data. We have to rely on other sources of information, ranging from satellite evidence to mirror statistics made in China, to anecdotes, and they're all, of course, very imperfect. The Bank of Korean experts who monitor North Korea and produce annual national account estimates would readily recognize that these estimates are really heroic, and well, they have to come up with numbers, but they know that they're not correct. For example, they use relative prices of South Korea to estimate activity in North Korea, which is wrong, but there's no other way to do it. So it's very difficult to pass judgment on outcomes. You can find people who claim that the growth rate in North Korea is very different from what these Bank of Korea statistics suggest, and that there has been a boomlet in the mid-2010s. We can come back to that later, perhaps. What we do observe, however, and we documented it in our paper with Jinwoan, is that the sanctions have had an effect on trade flows. Some of the trade flows have clearly been affected, but these are trade flows measured by the mirror statistics. Maybe I can ask the first slide to be put on the screen. These mirror statistics are the data that China produces, but of course these data completely miss what is going on in terms of smuggling, and there's a lot of smuggling across the border and over in the with, as you can see on this picture, ship-to-ship transfers of oil, for example. Normally oil imports are capped by the sanctions, but it is clear, and this has been documented in the report that the UN experts published very recently on the effectiveness of the sanctions. It's clear that the imports of oil are much larger than what is actually allowed under the sanctions, and likewise North Korea continues to export lots of coal, which is strictly forbidden as well. Another example of circumvention of the sanctions is the transport by truck across the Chinese border of metal, which is presumably destined to the construction site where the Pyongyang General Hospital is being erected right now. So there are many ways around the sanctions, and they're more and more overt. China apparently is no longer as zealous with respect to implementations of the UN sanctions. That said, the sanctions do hinder imports of critical inputs for industry and agriculture. We read reports, for example, of fertilizer plants that struggle because they can't get the inputs they need, which are imported inputs. We also read about humanitarian efforts that are hampered by some of the sanctions, even though in principle they should not be. So you asked, Randall, whether sanctions, if they were lifted, would unleash growth in North Korea. I would argue that it's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one. Corruption, red tape, coupled with the outsized resources spent on the military, hold back economic development even more than the sanctions.
I think that's the key point. The sanctions is a necessary but not sufficient condition for economic development. Do you think it would help with the special economic zones? Korea's had these zones since, I think, 1991. And since 2012, I think there are 20 more of these special economic zones. And these are a bit different because most are located next to China geographically, and many are started by local governments rather than the national government. So do you see much optimism or hope that these special economic zones will finally start to play a role? The only successful one was, of course, was Geaseong, which was built by South Korea, but is now unfortunately closed.
Yes, let's put up the Geaseong slide, please. Well, actually, even Geaseong was not really a success. It was supposed to bring together the comparative advantages of the two Koreas, with South Korea developing the land and power infrastructure, its firms investing in the facilities, while North Korea provided low-wage workers. And it had an ideal location, as you can see on this map on the slide, close to Seoul, close to Incheon, really very strategically located. But we should remember that it really failed miserably if you look at the ambition that underpinned this project. The ambition was to have 2,000 enterprises and 350,000 workers. In the event, the zone never had more than 125 enterprises and 55,000 workers. So it remained very small. And in fact, its operations were interrupted several times. It was really difficult. So as you say, Randall, they have created quite a few other zones, notably connected to China, even though those zones were mostly to facilitate industrial and technological catch-up rather than testing grounds for economic reforms. So by design, they were not quite as ambitious as Geaseong. And foreign partners have been reluctant to engage, preferring to stick to trade rather than investment. Why? Well, they just face too many major obstacles. First of all, the rule of law doesn't exist. It's rather the rule by law, I mean, in the sense of the law being used against you. Of course, wages and rents are low, but then foreign firms need to bear the cost of infrastructure development, and they face corruption everywhere they look. Plus, there's the international sanctions and the uncertainty associated with how they may evolve. And then, last but not least, there's a reputational risk taken by firms who might go ahead. So all in all, it's really, really problematic to attract foreign investment in North Korea. I would recommend an excellent paper by Theo Clement that KEI published last year on the special economic zones in their academic paper series, which is the best piece that I've encountered on the subject.
In terms of specific sectors, the government is targeting tourism, as a way of getting foreign currency. And it's attractive because it's not covered by the United Nations sanctions. So we have a special project such as the Wonsan on the East Coast, the ski resort at Mashik. Before the pandemic, about 90% of tourists were Chinese. Do you think it's realistic that after the pandemic eases that North Korea can be successful in making tourism a source of growth?
Well, as you say, tourism is one of the few sectors that are not subject to international sanctions at the moment. And so it is a potential significant currency earner. There are many beautiful sites in North Korea. So it does make sense in principle for the regime to try and leverage this potential source of income. We can put up the slide on Chinese tourism, please. Chinese tourism has expanded very much in recent years. It has replaced the tourist inflow from South Korea between 1998 and 2008. Over 2 million South Koreans actually visited Mount Kumgang until a South Korean tourist was shot there, and this stopped altogether. So nowadays it's really the Chinese who account for the bulk of the foreign visitors. In fact, there are too many of them, as you can see on the picture taken on top of Mount Petku. Like in some other countries, there's a problem of overcrowding, and there's clearly a problem of lack of infrastructure to receive and capitalize on a tourist inflow. The places that you mentioned, Randall, are meant for foreigners, but also for domestic wealthy tourists. So it's they're not just meant to bring in foreign exchange. And some of them are quite strange, like the Wonsan one, which used to be a military base and now is supposed to be a dual purpose place. So it is a bit bizarre. And whether the investments, the considerable investments made by the regime in these resorts are the best use of scarce public resources is another question.
I should have mentioned that your audience is welcome to send in questions. Please use the Q&A button, and we'll turn to those towards the end of the hour. Looking at the other sectors, manufacturing, for example, that's fallen from about a third of GDP down to about a fifth, reflecting a very weak and out-of-date capital base. When we look at South Korea's economic takeoff in the 1960s and 70s, fixed investment accounted for about 25% of GDP. In North Korea, the military accounts for about 25% of GDP. Do you think it's necessary for North Korea to have a peace dividend in order to reignite the manufacturing sector?
Well, maybe we can put up the next chart, which is about the share of manufacturing and other sectors in the economy, or rather the evolution in volume terms of each of those sectors. The chart shows clearly that heavy industry collapsed completely during the 1990s and never recovered. Light industry did a little bit better, it recovered most of the lost ground, but even then performance has been mediocre. And then services did better still. They actually grew, but they grew by less than 1% on average per annum over the past 3 decades. So especially by Asian standards, and especially for an economy starting from such a low level, this is really a dismal record. And yes, as long as resources go massively into the military, it's hard to see the industrial sector or the broader economy take off in earnest. A peace dividend could help spur economic development. That's true, especially if it comes, as it would, presumably, with the lifting of sanctions. But as we discussed, other conditions are crucial as well, to do with a legal framework for economic activity and the rule of law more generally.
One of the problems for manufacturing is the lack of electricity. And we know that generation of electricity in North Korea is only about 5% of the South. And I read the World Bank said that 57% of North Koreans do not have access to electricity. So this seems to be a major bottleneck in trying to develop industry as well as other sectors. What do you think could be done to try to promote better access to electricity in North Korea?
Yes, we can put up the next slide, please. Electricity shortages are indeed a major and recurrent issue in North Korea. As the slide shows, the generation of electricity by 2018 was 10% or so below the level in 1990, even though the population grew in the meantime. And as the next slide shows, you can see that at nighttime, most of North Korea remains a black hole, especially compared to all the neons that illuminate Seoul. Electricity provision varies greatly across regions, and power shortages are clearly much worse outside Pyongyang, but they even affect Pyongyang and they affect the army and some core national defense institutions at times. So there's really a major problem there. And what is North Korea doing to address it? Well, one avenue has been assistance from Big Brother China. Reports suggest that recently installed Chinese generators supply around 40% of Pyongyang's power use, for example. And another avenue is the development of alternative and greener energy sources. For example, the installation of small-scale solar panels in farms, nurseries, and so on. Reportedly, there are now over 100,000 homes that have solar equipment on their roof. That would also be a way to address the problem of air pollution, which is very severe in North Korea. Of course, another avenue would be to improve the energy efficiency of the industrial sector, which is very poor. But this would require major investment, and we have discussed already what obstacles stand in the way of major investment.
I know that Jinwoan has looked a lot at the question of food shortages, and the paper cites the estimate by the FAO that I think 40% of North Korea's population suffered from food shortages during the 2018-2019 crop year. On the other hand, we see that rice prices and other food prices have not really gone up. They've been quite stable. So how do we square the reports of a food shortage with a stable food price? In addition, Kim Jong-un said that the 2018-19 harvest was the best on record. So where's the truth in all of this? Is there a food shortage in North Korea? And what is the outlook for this year, 2020? I've read that there are 4,000 boats at Dangdong waiting to get into North Korea. And many of these boats seem to have equipment and seeds, what you need for the planting season, which will start about now. And so does that mean we'll have a food shortage in 2020? So your views on this would be very helpful, Jinwoan.
Maybe we can put up the next slide.
Yeah, I'm delighted to see Linda again. And as you know well, North Korea has been a very difficult situation in the food supply for decades. As quoted in our OECD report, the World Food Program and the Food and Agriculture Organization estimate that North Korea lacks over 1.3 million tons of food. And WFP also warned that due to the coronavirus pandemic, North Korea could face a severe food crisis this year. In January, North Korea shut down the border with China. In this result, the trade between two countries is reported to hit the record low, reportedly to nearly 90% of decrease. In particular, the decline in agricultural imports, such as fertilizers, machinery, and fuels, is expected to reduce significantly food price this year. Adding to this, a falling in food imports is also likely to exacerbate the food shortages in North Korea. And in the containers in Dandong in China are believed to contain the considerable many agricultural materials, such as fertilizers and equipment as well. And also in April, North Korea reportedly had bad weather over low temperatures. The temperature was 10 degrees below on average. This climate change could have also a negative impact on this year's food productions as well. However, there is different view that North Korea has the ability to mobilize its resources. Looking at the recent food price, the rice prices remains relatively stable, as you see, despite the border close between China and North Korea. The rice prices in 3 major cities were around 4,500 in January, but the rice prices rose to around 6,000 North Korean won in early February due to the border closing. However, in April, the rice prices were stably trading at around 5,000 North Korean won in the market. We can also presume that many North Korean markets have helped the food price stable. North Korean people now can buy food and necessities in the market. They also can purchase processed food such as biscuit, noodle, and bread other than rice. In addition, the crop production and small gardens allowed around their homes has somewhat helped to ease food shortages as well. In fact, according to survey from the North Korean defectors, their protein intake from meat also gradually increased significantly compared to the past. So North Korea also might increase the ration of stockpiles rice and crops to stabilize food prices. North Korea also knows well soaring food prices can cause social unrest in the country from the previous experiences. While the North Korea did not succeed, the country continued to make efforts to increase food production, while the disseminating agricultural techniques and increasing fertilizer productions as well. In early May, the Kim Jong-un visited the new fertilizer ceremony after 20 days long disappearance, which reflects that the North Korea government has also deep interest in food production this year. Despite border closure, exceptionally, the North Korea is reported to import some products from China in April. And as China seems to contain the virus recently, there is a possible that North Korea reopen the border. If the border reopens, it is possible to import some urgent agricultural items for food production this year. Conclusionally, the decrease of agricultural imports and unfavorable weather conditions are likely to aggravate the food shortages this year. However, we need more time and information to evaluate the exact food situation in North Korea. Thank you.
So it seems that humanitarian aid might be important, and that's not covered by sanctions. It's not prohibited by sanctions into the north. Let's talk about the Donju, this new class of mercantile class that's been created by the marketization. The Donju evidently are major financiers of many government projects. I read recently that the government in North Korea is going to issue bonds to try to tap in to the foreign currency held by the Donju. To what extent do the Donju, have they replaced state financial institutions? And how can the government fully use their resources to pursue its projects?
Excellent question. The Donju originally engaged in cross-border smuggling, and they worked for the trading companies under the Workers' Party, the military, and the government agencies that were involved in exporting raw materials and importing finished products from China mainly. So in that sense, yes, indeed, they initially built their wealth and influence based on the country's isolation, and they accumulated a considerable capital and influence. With that, they've expanded their activities in markets for consumer goods, for transport, distribution, and importantly, as you mentioned, Randall, for money lending. They act as private financiers for various business ventures. And they play also an important role in the circumvention of international sanctions, to hark back to what we discussed earlier. They also run businesses within the shell of state-owned enterprises, which is a very peculiar form of entrepreneurship, which very few OECD countries know about. I would underline that the government sort of colludes with the donju. It can be to keep the price of rice stable. We just discussed that. Or it can be to undertake complex projects that require money and international sourcing. But collusion doesn't mean that there are no tensions between the government and the donju. And the example you mentioned is very relevant, Randall, that of the recent issuance of public bonds. I think one of the questions that is being asked by our listeners is also about that. This is the first issuance since 2003. And factories, enterprises are being pressured to purchase these bonds, as are the donju. And these bonds have to be paid with hard currency. So it's basically one of the many ways in which the regime tries to cope with the depletion of foreign exchange reserves and with the need for financial resources. And needless to say, many of the donju are quite upset by this attempt to sequester some of their resources. This form of financial repression is not one they appreciate. The donjus have also, as you alluded to, Randall, been playing a big role in the real estate development sector. Maybe we can put up the slide that illustrates this. It's one of the large urban development projects, one of the scientists' streets in Pyongyang. And the donju have been very instrumental in the real estate boom that saw these buildings across the skyline of Pyongyang in recent years. And then the donju get sort of compensated for the investment they make by getting building usage rights after construction. They have used their clout to raise their influence and social status and advance their economic interests. And they receive medals and awards for their donations, which can serve as a mitigating factor when they're punished for illegal activities. For me, the donju are very much the North Korean hybrid economy's rent seekers. They contribute to and benefit from a form of stability, and they may not have a vested interest in genuine regime change. So they may be an obstacle to genuine reform.
I know that Andrei Lenkov, the expert in South Korea, compares them to a species of fish that survive in the very depths of the ocean. And once North Korea normalizes, they'll no longer survive in this very peculiar environment. So it raises the question, do they really want Korea to normalize, become a normal market economy? Let me finish with a kind of a long-range question. What do you think are the prospects for North-South reunification at some point, or if not unification, at least some sort of economic rapprochement? And what role do you envision that the OECD could play in helping this to come to pass?
Well, maybe we can put up the slide of the rapprochement at the top to illustrate this. The Ministry of Unification, which we always visit when we go to Korea for our OECD missions, was created in the late 1960s, even though at the time it was the National Unification Board, and it gained ministerial status in the late 90s. So ever since that time, there has been active planning for some kind of rapprochement on the part of the officialdom in South Korea. And unification remains an aspiration, even though it is perhaps shared less and less clearly by the population in South Korea. But President Moon, he is definitely very keen on it. His parents were actually refugees from North Korea. And he, as soon as he came into office, made big efforts to promote rapprochement. For example, in July 2017, he launched the Berlin Initiative, which aimed at peaceful coexistence and common prosperity through the creation of a Korean Peninsula new economy community. And the goal was, I quote the Ministry of Unification's official words, to build a single market on the Korean Peninsula, to create new growth engines and to create an inter-Korean economic community of coexistence and co-prosperity. So a lot of big words. You can see on the picture that President Moon, who's a keen mountain climber, when he visited Mount Petku in September 2018, was able to check a major item on his bucket list. He was very, very pleased to go there. And he continues to push these days for a fourth summit with Kim Jong-un in the course of this year. And he has put several ideas on the table on how to advance cooperation given the restrictions imposed by the sanctions. One of the ideas is to reconnect the railways across the DMZ. There was a question by the listeners about that. This is indeed one of the things that have been pushed under this administration. And I visited the DMZ Adorasan train station last summer, so I was able to see this very interesting connection between the railways north and south of the 38th parallel, with the customs office and the immigration facilities, but of course no travelers just yet. And then President Moon is also pushing to resume tourism tours at Mount Kumgam and to reopen the Geaseong industrial complex. There have actually been meetings in the US, a number of SME owners who have operations in Geaseong tried to convince lawmakers in DC to support the reopening of the industrial complex. So there are a number of efforts in this direction. I would recommend the forthcoming paper by you, Randall, which is a bit of a science fiction or futurology paper on how reunification might happen at the 2032 horizon. This is the year when the North and South have proposed to jointly organize the Summer Olympics. So if you're very bold, you can imagine what would happen on this front. You asked what the OECD can do. Well, so far the OECD has highlighted North Korea as a contingent liability in each and every economic survey of South Korea, which we publish every 2 years. And we have stepped up our monitoring efforts, but that's about as far as we can go for the moment.
I think the OECD's focused on best policies. I think the OECD has a lot to teach North Korea and other countries as well on best practices in successful countries. So I think we don't have money to lend, but we certainly have a stock of technical knowledge. I think that'd be very useful in how to run a census, how to run a tax system, et cetera, across the board. My personal experience in teaching or speaking with young South Koreans, I'm always surprised at how little interest or enthusiasm I find for unification. And so I hope this isn't an idea that will fade over time, given this generational change. Well, thank you very much, Vincent and Jinwoan, for those excellent comments. And we have a number of questions that we have time to go through. Let's start with one from Roderick Gay. And he asked, does it seem that Kim Jong-un puts less emphasis on the Jeonche doctrine, or self-reliance or autarky, than his father and grandfather, Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung respectively? I ask this because your working paper mentions a rise in real estate prices, which would indicate the state-appropriated housing has been lessened and the marketization of the services and consumer goods sectors through state-owned enterprises.
Well, initially that was indeed the impression that less emphasis would be put on Juche. But lately, the official press in North Korea has been playing up Juche again, perhaps due to the circumstances with the COVID-19 crisis. Of course, cross-border flows are seriously hampered, notwithstanding the resumption of some trade on the Chinese border in recent weeks. And so in that context, we have had statements, for example, that state-owned enterprises should henceforth produce their own raw material, which is sort of a negation of the concept of value chains across firms. And this has upset quite a few enterprise managers because they don't see how they could produce the raw materials that they need to produce what they're supposed to produce. So in that sense, the self-sufficiency concept has regained some prominence, but this is sort of forced by the circumstances and may not last. Hopefully it won't, because it is, of course, an illusion that you can rely only on your own forces if you want to prosper and to become a developed economy.
Thank you. Russell Pittman asked that question about the railroads. I guess one question I might add, given the sanctions, is it possible at this point to reopen these lines along the east coast and west coast of Korea? Or do we have to wait until sanctions are relaxed to really develop these inter-Korea railroads?
Well, the legal aspect, I'm not an expert on exactly the fine print of all these sanctions. That's more a question for the UN experts. But one of the issues is that this line would run close to some military bases, and so would have to avoid them. So that there are serious practical problems associated with this project. So would North Koreans be keen to see some trains with views on the military facilities? Obviously not. But frankly, on how compatible this is with the lifting, with the existing sanctions, and which clauses would have to be revisited to make it possible, I'm not sure.
Right.
That is very much a question of political will more than what is exactly in the sanctions as they stand right now.
There's a question on from Bill Brown, and this is about the question of the bond sales that we mentioned. He asks, is this a sign of desperation by Kim? Is his regime running out of options? And will it lead to rampant inflation and a devaluation of the won? Very speculative question, very important.
Well, it is true that this is the first time in almost 20 years that the regime is issuing bonds, and these are not bonds like bonds that are issued in OECD countries. These are a way basically to force actors, in this case enterprises and donju, to give up some of their hard currency to the regime. So in that sense, yes, it's an act of desperation, because the regime would not resort to this kind of measure and upset the donju, who after all are their best supporters, if it did need to do that. At the same time, the regime is undertaking a number of ambitious, high-cost projects. So there's this tension that how can you at the same time have these military ambitions, these grandiose tourism resorts ambitions, build this fantastical hospital in Pyongyang, which is supposed to be very modern, and so on, without resources and with basically very little foreign trade mostly in the form of smuggling, and a moribund domestic sector, especially in heavy industry, but not much better in other domestic sectors. There is obviously, it's hard to square the circle. Down the road, inflation could be a result, although how much open inflation there might be is another question, because the number of prices remain controlled. So it's not clear whether you would see it in the prices in the same way that you would see it in a market economy, but you would see it in the black market exchange rate, for example.
Liz Kim from Voice of America has a related question on what does this say about North Korea's foreign exchange reserves? Are they going through a sharp decline because of the border closure and the sanctions? And how serious is the foreign reserve crisis right now?
Well, this is a question that's really difficult to answer, because even OECD countries are often very secretive about the amount of forex reserves that they actually have. Or China has long been very secretive. It's a bit more open now, but there are these other forms of foreign exchange reserves that they also hold, which are not well quantified. For North Korea, where even GDP is state secret, no one really knows what the foreign exchange reserves are. What we can observe is some of the drivers of foreign exchange reserves. After all, these are a residual from the balance of payment operations. So the drivers are indeed suggesting that they may be running low because North Korea needs to continue to import a number of things for its economy to survive. And it cannot export very much. So the trade balance doesn't look too good. Tourism has essentially stopped with the COVID crisis and may not resume quickly. So a number of sources have dried up. There are foreign workers who also are a means to bring in foreign exchange into North Korea. Many of them have been repatriated, even though a number of them remain abroad with tourist visas or in other ways they manage to stay abroad despite the sanctions. But that's another source of foreign exchange that has partially dried up. So a number of the foreign exchange earning mechanisms are not delivering the goods. And one can infer, even though it's a conjecture, that yes, these reserves are being depleted.
There's a related question. Since North Korea is such an import-dependent economy, what does the COVID crisis mean for a country that depends so much on imports?
Well, it depends on imports for certain things like oil, like some agricultural goods, fertilizers, consumer goods. Some of these things are more problematic than others. I mean, if they can't import as many electronic goods from China as they could last year, maybe this is not a big issue. But if they cannot get hold of the agricultural inputs that they need to population, that's a bigger issue. I think all the countries around the world are facing very severe challenges in the context of the COVID crisis. We often talk about North Korea as being an isolated country, a hermit state, but of course it isn't a hermit state. It has a deep connection with surrounding countries, China mainly, but also Russia, for example. And it is affected by this global crisis. Of course, so far, North Korea has not admitted to any COVID cases domestically, which is interesting. There was a KEI talk on this not very long ago, and this remains somewhat mysterious. But they are clearly very much alarmed by it domestically as well. They actually were among the first countries to take measures already around the 20th or 21st of January. They stopped the flights from China, and then they stopped tourism well before countries elsewhere in the OECD took similar measures. So that they are very alarmed, in part because the health system is so fragile in North Korea, and so they would not be able to cope with a big number of infections.
Another question from Bill Brown on how do you evaluate the labor market in North Korea? He says it appears that state workers have to depend on very low wages, plus rations, which are less and less available, and market workers earn much more. Can the regime raise state workers' salaries to reflect the market prices? And if not, won't they quit working?
Well, many of the state workers don't really work in their state enterprise. They nominally, they hold a job there, but their real activity and their real income comes from their activity in the private sector. And as I mentioned, some of these state-owned enterprises are just shells and sort of disguises for privately driven business operations. It's very hard to analyze the labor market as we lack data. Clearly, there's a lot of underemployment of the existing labor force, but at the same time, one can think that big chunks of the labor force their potential productivity is not very high because their skill level is rather low. So I really struggle as an OECD economist to read the labor market in North Korea But what is clear is that the wages in state-owned enterprises are token wages, and that the real income has to come from somewhere else.
We have a question from Won-Hyuk Im, a friend from KDI, and he writes that the Bank of Korea's estimates for North Korea's coal production and mining activities and light industry began before sanctions really began to bite in the second half of 2018. And it seems to be inconsistent with trade statistics. Although Bank of Korea estimates that coal production in North Korea was stagnant in this period, we know that North Korea's coal exports to China dramatically increased in the 2010s without seriously affecting coal-using industries in the north. We also know that North Korea's light industry exports, clothes, for example, increased, and Pyongyang conducted an import substitution program for consumer products. These trends suggest that North Korea's economic growth in this period was much higher than the Bank of Korea's estimate. What do you think?
Well, there's a very lively debate on the Bank of Korea's numbers, which are really wild guesses based on a lot of heroic assumptions. And indeed, some people claim that they know that the actual growth is much higher. I don't really know how they can know that. They can conjecture, as they can offer counter conjectures to the Bank of Korea conjectures, but the evidence that you cite is very partial. I mean, it doesn't take into account what's happening in agriculture, for example, which is still a big sector in North Korea, and in the service sector in general. It's true that there are many sort of anecdotal signs that there is that are vibrant markets. These general markets I mentioned, some of them are as big as the huge markets that we see in Seoul. So these are really, really large-scale market-based operations, distorted, of course, by the intervention of the authorities who try to racketeer the stall owners and have them pay substantial fees to stand there, and then extort bribes on top of that. So it's a very hybrid sort of a system. But assessing how much this is growing year after year, that's really impossible, essentially. We want to do it because we want numbers to underpin our but it is really hard. And I think the current crisis is a good reminder how hard it can be. I mean, in a number of OECD countries now, we're not going to have plausible GDP numbers for the first half of this year. We're not going to have comparable price statistics because they cannot be monitored. I mean, stores have shut down, the inspectors cannot visit the stores. So even in our advanced economies, the numbers may be very dicey, and it's very hard to properly estimate GDP. So in a place like North Korea, where all the incentives are geared against accurate statistics, and then the instruments are not in place. There are no surveys, no proper surveys, etc., to measure the things we'd like to measure. I think we could quarrel ad nauseam on what is really the growth rate in North Korea. It's just impossible to say for sure.
Dr. Im has one more question related to agriculture. Maybe Jinwoan would like to answer on this. He points out that South Korea's Rural Development Corporation published an estimate in December last year saying that North Korea's food crop increased by 3% in 2019. So in contrast to the ideas of a very bad harvest. And he says, given the COVID-19 crisis and border controls, isn't the real concern really about 2020?
Yeah, I think that this year the COVID-19 could affect the North Korea's food production very significantly. And South Korea also offered the 50,000 rice prices supply to North Korea, but North Korea last year rejected the South Korea's offer. And also COVID-19 also hindered the international assistance to North Korea, which could affect the North Korea's food import or food supporting food stability situation as well in this year.
And Troy from KEI adds on to this with the question about the drop in exports from China to North Korea. We know that exports of food, plastic coverings, fertilizer have fallen to either minimal levels or even to zero. And so this will probably have a very severe impact on food security in the North. You would probably agree with that statement as well.
Yeah, actually it happened, but I guess that even the North Korea closed the borders between South China and North Korea, but as some exceptionally some essential items now is reportedly that North Korea imported from the China, even though they closed the border, and some agriculture products such as fertilizer, some very emergent items is feasible to imported into North Korea, with the very restricted amount.
Thank you. I think we've run out of time. It's 11 o'clock. We haven't had time to go through all the questions. I'm sorry, but I think it's been a very interesting session, and I want to thank Vincent and Jinwoan for their work and coming today to talk about these issues. And I hope the OECD will have time and resources to continue working on North Korea, which will help all for this the future. So thank you very much, and enjoy Paris.